but it meant so much to me to have it said out and free and flying. That was the discontent I endured that night. My father stopped reading, I realized right then. That was the real reconciliation I was trying to make and couldn't. And that's what I think this book's about. All the Columbia experts can spiel all they want about the delicious satire. They're crazy. This book says life isn't fair, and I'm telling you, one and all, you better believe it. I got fat spoiled, son. He's not gonna nab Miss Reingold, and he's always gonna be fat. Even if he gets skinny, he'll still be fat, and he'll still be spoiled. And life will never be enough to make him happy, and that's my fault. Maybe make it all my fault if you want. The point is, we're not created equal. For the rich, they sing, life isn't fair. I got a cold wife. She's brilliant, she's stimulating, she's terrific. There's no love. That's okay. Just so long as we don't keep expecting everything to somehow even out for us before we die. Look, grown-ups, skip this paragraph. I'm not about to tell you this book has a tragic ending. I already said in the very line how it was my favorite book in the world. But there's a lot of bad stuff coming up. Torture you've already been probably prepared for. There's worse. There's death coming up, and you better understand this. Some of the wrong people die. Be ready for it. This isn't Curious George uses the potty. Nobody warned me, and it wasn't my own fault. You'll see what I mean in a little. And that was my mistake. So I'm not letting it happen to you. The wrong people die, some of them. And the reason this is because life is not fair. Forget all the garbage your parents put out. Remember, Morgenstern, you'll be a lot happy. Okay, enough. Back to the next nightmare time. The next night, she dreamed of giving birth to their first child, and it was a girl, a beautiful little girl. And Buttercup said, I'm sorry it wasn't a boy. I know you need an heir. And Humperdinck said, Beloved sweet, don't concern yourself with that. Just look at this glorious child God has given us. And then he left, and Buttercup held the child to her perfect breast, and the child said, Your milk is sour. And Buttercup said, Oh, I'm sorry. And she lifted to the other breast, and the child said, No, this is sour too. And Buttercup said, I don't know what to do. And the baby said, You always know what to do. You always know exactly what to do, and you always do exactly what's right for you, and the rest of the world can go hang. And Buttercup said, You mean Wesley? And the baby said, Of course I mean Wesley. And Buttercup explained patiently, I thought he was dead, you see. I'd given my word to your father. And the baby said, I'm dying now. There's no love in your milk, and your milk has killed me. And then the child stiffened and cracked and turned in Buttercup's hands to do nothing but dry and dust. And Buttercup screamed and screamed, even when she was awake again. With 59 days to go until her marriage, she was still screaming. The third nightmare came quickly the following evening, and again it was a baby, this time a son, a marvelous strong boy. And Humperdinck said, Beloved, it's a boy. And Buttercup said, I didn't fail you, thank heavens. And then he was gone, and Buttercup called out, May I see my son now? And all the doctors scurried around outside her royal room, but the boy was not brought in. What seems to be the trouble? Buttercup called out, and the chief doctor said, I don't quite understand, but he doesn't want to see you, said Buttercup. And Buttercup said, Tell him I am his mother, and I am the queen, and I command his presence. And then he was there, just as handsome as a baby boy as anyone could wish for. Close it, said Buttercup, and the doctors closed the door. The baby stood in the corner as far from her bed as he could. Come here, darling, Buttercup said. Why? Are you going to kill me too? I'm your mother, and I love you. Now come here. I've never killed anybody. You killed Wesley. Did you see his face in the fire swamp when you walked away and left him? That's what I'm calling killing. When you're older, you'll understand things. Now I'm not going to tell you again. Come here. Murderer! The baby shouted. Murderer! But by then she was out of the bed and she had him in her arms and he was saying, Stop that, this instant, I love you. And he said, Your love is poison, it kills. And he died in her arms and she started to cry. Even when she was awake again, with 58 days to go until her marriage, she was still crying. The next night she simply refused to go to sleep. Instead, she walked and read and did needlework and drank cup after cup of steaming tea from the Indies. She felt sick with weariness, of course, but such was her fear of what she might dream that preferred any waking discomfort to whatever sleep might have to offer. And at dawn her mother was pregnant. No, more than pregnant. Her mother was having a baby. And as Buttercup stood there in the corner of the room, she watched herself being born, and her father gasped at her beauty, and so did her mother, and the midwife was the first to show concern. The midwife was a sweet and known throughout the village for her love of babies, and she said, "Look, trouble." And the father said, "What trouble? Never before did you see such a beauty." And the midwife said, "Don't you understand? Why was she given such beauty? It's because she has no heart. Here, listen, the baby is alive, but there is no beat." And she held Buttercup's chest against her father's ear, and the father could only nod and say, "We must find a miracle man to place a heart inside." But the midwife said, that would be wrong, I think. I've heard before of creatures like this, the heartless ones. As they grow bigger, they get more and more beautiful, and behind them is nothing but broken bodies and shattered souls. And these without hearts and anguish bringers. And my advice would be, since you're both still young, to have another child, a different child, and be rid of this one now. But of course, the final decision is up to you." And the father said to the mother, "Well?" And the mother said, "Since the midwife is the kindest person in the village, she must know a monster when she sees one. Let's get to it." So Buttercup's father and Buttercup's mother put their hands to the baby's throat, and the baby began to gasp. Even when Buttercup was awake again at dawn, with 57 days to go till her marriage, she could not stop gasping. From then on, the nightmares became simply too frightening. When there was 50 days to go, Buttercup knocked one night on the door of the Prince Humperdinck's chambers. She entered when he bid her to. "I see trouble," he said. "You look very ill." And so she did. Beautiful, of course, still that, but in no way well. Buttercup did not see quite how to begin. He ushered her into a chair. He got her water. She sipped at it. Darling, dead ahead. He put the glass to one side. "At your convenience, Princess," he said. "It comes to this," Buttercup began. "In the fire swamp I made the worst mistake in all the world. I love Wesley. I always have. It seems I always will. I did not know this when you came to me. Please believe me what I am about to say. When you said that I must marry or face death, I answered, 'Kill me.' I meant that. I mean this now, too. If you say I must marry you in 50 days, I will be dead by morning." The prince was literally stunned. After a long moment, he knelt by Buttercup's chair, and in his gentlest voice started to speak. "I admit that when we first became engaged, there was to be no love involved. That was as much my choice as yours, though the notion may have come from you. But surely you must have noticed that in this last month of parties and festivities, a certain warming of my attitude." "I have. You have been both sweet and noble." "Thank you. Having said that, I hope you appreciate how difficult this next sentence is for me to say. I would die myself rather than cause you unhappiness by standing in the way of your marrying the man you love." Buttercup wanted almost to weep with gratitude. She said, "I will bless you with all my days of kindness." Then she stood. "So it's settled. Our wedding is off." He stood too. "Except perhaps for one thing." "That being?" "Have you considered the possibility that he not now want any longer to marry you?" Until that moment she had not. "You were, I hate to remind you, not altogether gentle with his emotions in the fire swamp. Forgive me for saying that, beloved, but you did leave him in the lurch, in a manner of speaking." Buttercup sat down hard. Her turn now to be stunned. Humperdinck knelt again beside her. "This Wesley of yours, this sailor boy, he has pride?" Buttercup managed to whisper, "More than any man alive, I sometimes think." "Well, consider then, dearest. Here he is, off sailing somewhere with the dread pirate Roberts. He has a month to survive the emotional scars you dealt with him. What if he wants to remain single? Or worse, what if he found another?" Buttercup was now even beyond whispering. "I think, sweetest child, that we should strike a bargain, you and I. If Wesley wants to marry you, still bless you both. If, for reasons unpleasant to mention, his pride will not let him, then you will marry me, as planned, and be the Queen of Florin." "He couldn't be married, I'm sure, not my Wesley." She looked at the prince. "But how can I find out?" "What about this? You write him a letter, telling him everything. We'll make 4 copies. I'll tell our fast ships and order them off in all directions. The dread pirate Roberts is not often more than a month's sail from Florin. Whichever of my ships finds him will run the white flag of truce. Deliver your letter, and Wesley can decide. If no, he can speak that message to my captain. If yes, my captain will sail him here to you, and we will have content myself somehow with a lesser bride. I'm not sure, but I definitely think that this is the most generous decision I have yet heard." Do me this favor then in return. Until we know Wesley's intentions one way or another, let us continue as we have, so festivities will not be halted. And if I seem too fond of you, remember that I cannot help myself." "Agreed," Buttercup said, going to the door, but not before she kissed his cheek. He followed her. "Off with you now, and write your letter," and he returned the kiss, smiling with his eyes at her until the corridor curved her from his sight. There was no doubt whatsoever in his mind that he was going to see too fond of her in the days ahead, because when she died in murder on their wedding night, it was crucial that all of Florin realized the depth of his love, the epical of his loss. Since then, no one would dare hesitate to follow him in a revenge war, as he was to launch it against Gilder. At first, when he hired the Sicilian, he was convinced it was best that someone else do her in, all the while making it appear the work of the soldiers from Gilder. And when the man in black had somehow materialized to spoil his plans, the prince came close to going insane with rage. But now his basic and optimistic nature had reasserted itself. Everything always worked out for the best. The people were confronted with Buttercup now as they had been even before the kidnapping. And when he announced from his castle balcony that she had been murdered, he already saw the scene in his mind. He would arrive just too late to save her from strangling, but soon enough to see Gilderian soldiers leaping from the window of the bedroom to the soft ground below. When he had made his speech to the masses on the 500th anniversary of his country, well, there wouldn't be a dry eye in the square. And although he was just at the least bit perturbed, since he had never actually killed a woman before with his bare hands, there was a first time for everything. Besides, if you taunted something done right, you did it yourself. That night, they began to torture Wesley. Count Rugen did the actual playing, including the prince simply sat by, asking questions out loud, inwardly admiring the count's skill. The count really cared about pain. The whys behind the screams interested him fully as much as the anguish itself. And whereas the prince spent his life in physicality following the hunt, Count Rugen read and studied anything he could get his hands on dealing with the subject of distress. "All right now," the prince said to Wesley, who lay in the great fifth-level cage. "Before we begin, I want you to answer me this. Have you any complaints about your treatment thus far?" "None whatever," Wesley replied, and in truth he had none. Oh, he might have preferred being unchained a bit now and then, but if you were to be captive, you couldn't ask for more than he had been given. The albino's medical ministrations had been precise, and his shoulder was fine again. The food the albino brought had always been hot and nourishing, the wine and brandy wonderfully warming against the darkness of the underground cage. "You feel fit, then," the prince went on. "I assume my legs are a little stiff from being chained, but other than that, yes." "Good. Then I promise you this as God himself is my witness. Answer the next question and I will set you free this night. But you must answer it honestly, fully, without withholding nothing. If you lie, I will know, and then I'll lose the count on you." "I have nothing to hide," Wesley said. "Ask away." "Who hired you to kidnap the princess?" "It was someone from Gilder. We found fabric indicating as much on the princess's horse. Tell me that man's name and you are free. Speak." "No one hired me," Wesley said. "I was working strictly freelance, and I didn't kidnap her. I saved her from others who were doing that very thing. You seem a reasonable fellow, and my princess claims to have known you many years, so I will give you, on her account, one last and final chance. The name of the man in Gilder who hired you. Tell me, or face your torture." "No one hired me, I swear." The count set fire to Wesley's hands. Nothing permanent or disabling. He just dipped Wesley's hand into oil and brought a candle close enough to set things bubbling. When Wesley had screamed, "No one! No one! No one! On my life!" a sufficient number of times, the count dipped Wesley's hands in water, and he and the prince left via the underground entrance, leaving the medication to the albino, who was always nearby during the torturing times, but never visible enough to be distracting. I feel quite invigorated," the count said, and as he and the prince began to ascend the underground staircase. "It's a perfect question. He was telling the truth, clearly. We both know that." The prince nodded. The count was privy to all of his innermost plans for the revenge war. "I'm fascinated to see what happens," the count went on. "Which plane will be at least endurable?" the physical or the mental anguish of having freedom offered if the truth is told, than telling it and being thought a liar. I think the physical, said the prince. I think you're wrong, said the count. Actually, they were both wrong. Wesley suffered not at all throughout. His screaming was totally a performance to please them. He had been practicing his defenses for a month now, and he was more than ready. The minute the count brought the candle close, Wesley raised his eye to the ceiling, dropped his eyelids over them, and in a state of deep and steady concentration, he took his brain away. Buttercup was what he thought of. Her autumn hair, her perfect skin, and he brought her very close beside him, and had her whisper in his ear throughout the burning, "I love you. I love you. I only left you in the fire swamp to test your love for me. Is it as great as mine for you? Can two such love exist on one planet at one time? Is there that much room, beloved Wesley?" The albino bandaged his fingers. Wesley lay still. For the first time, the albino started things, whispered, "You better tell them." From Wesley, a shrug. Whispered, "They never stop. Not once they start. Tell them what they want to know and have done with it." Shrug. Whispered, "The machine is nearly ready. They are testing it on animals now." Shrug. Whispered, "It's for your own good, and I tell you these things. My own good. What good? They're going to kill me anyway." From the albino. Nod. The prince found Buttercup waiting unhappily outside his chamber doors. "It's my letter," she began. "I cannot make it right." Come in," the prince said gently. "Maybe we can help." She sat down in the same chair as before. "All right, I'll close my eyes and listen. Read to me." "Wesley, my passion, my sweet, my only, my own. Come back. I shall kill myself otherwise. Yours in torment, Buttercup." She looked at Humperdinck. "Well, do you think I'm throwing myself at him?" "It does seem a bit forward," the prince admitted. "It doesn't leave him a great deal of room to maneuver. Will you help me improve it, please?" "I'll do what I can, sweet lady, but first it might help if I knew just a little bit about him. Is he really so wonderful, this Wesley of yours?" Not so much wonderful as perfect," she replied. "Kind of flawless. More or less magnificent, without blemish, rather on the ideal side." She looked at the prince. "Am I being helpful?" "I think emotions are clouding your objectivity just a bit. Do you actually think that there is nothing the fellow can't do?" Buttercup thought for a while. "It's not so much that there's nothing he can't do, it's more that he can do it all better than anybody else can do it." The prince chuckled and smiled. "In other words, for example, you mean if he wanted to hunt, he could out-hunt again, for example, someone such as myself?" "Oh, I think if he wanted to, he could quite easily, but he happens not to like hunting, at least to my knowledge. No, maybe he does. I don't know. I never knew he was so interested in mountain climbing, but he scaled the cliffs of insanity under most adverse conditions, and everyone agrees that this is not the easiest thing in the world to accomplish." "Well, why don't we just begin our letter with 'Divine Wesley' and appeal to his sense of modesty?" the prince suggested. Buttercup began to write, stopped. "Does divine begin with D-E or D-I?" "D-I, I believe, amazing creature," the prince replied, smiling gently as Buttercup commenced the letter. They composed it in 4 hours, and many, many times she said, "I could never get through this without you." And the prince was always most modest, asking little helpful personal questions about Wesley as often as well possible without drawing attention to it. And in this way, well before dawn, she told him, smiling as she remembered, of Wesley's fears of spinning ticks. And that night, in the fifth level of the cage, the prince asked, as was always to ask, "Tell me the name of the man in Gilder who hired you to kidnap the princess, and I promise you immediately freedom." And Wesley replied, as he always was to reply, "No one. I was alone." And the count, who had spent the day getting the spinners ready, placed them carefully on Wesley's skin, and Wesley closed his eyes and begged and pleaded, and after an hour or so the prince and the count left, the albino remaining behind with the core of the burning the spiders, and then pulling them free from Wesley, lest that accidentally poison him. And on the way up underground stairs to the ground level, the prince said, just for conversation's sake, "Much better, don't you think?" The count only said nothing, which was vaguely irritating to Humperdinck, because to the absolute truth, torture was never all that high on his scale of passions, and he would just soon have disposed of Wesley right then. If only Buttercup would admit that he, Humperdinck, was the better man. But she would not. She simply would not. All she ever talked about was Wesley. All she ever asked about was the news of Wesley. Days went by, weeks went by, party after party went by, and all Florin was moved by the spectacle of their great hunting prince, at last so clearly and wonderfully in love. But when they were alone, all she ever said was, "I wonder where Wesley could be. What could be taking him so long? How can I live until he comes?" Maddening. So each night the Count's discomforts, which made Wesley with and twist, were really sort of all right. The prince would manage an hour or so of spectating before he and the Count would leave. The Count still oddly silent, and down below, tending the wounds, the albino would whisper, "Tell them, please. They will only add to your suffering." Wesley could barely suppress his smile. He had felt no pain, not once, none. He had closed his eyes and taken his brain away. That was the secret. If you could take your brain away from the present and send it to where it would complement the skin like wintry cream, well, let them enjoy themselves. His revenge time would come. Wesley was living now most all for Buttercup, but there was no denying that there was one more thing he wanted to do. His time. Prince Humperdinck simply had no idea. There seemed to be no one decision in all of Florin that would one way or another and then it eventually come heavily to rest upon his shoulders. Not only was he getting married, his country was having its 500th anniversary. Not only was he noodling around in his mind and best ways to get a war going, he had also constantly had affection shining from his eyes. Every detail had to be met, and met correctly. His father was just no help at all, refusing either to expire or stop mumbling. You thought his father was dead, but that was in the fake out. Don't forget, Morgenstern was just edging into the nightmare sequence, so don't be confused. And start making sense. Queen Bella simply hovered him around, translating here and there, and was with shock that Prince Humperdinck realized just 12 days before his wedding day that he had neglected to set in motion the crucial Gilder selection plan. So he called Yellen to the castle late one night. Yellen was chief of all enforcement in Florence City, a job he had inherited from his father. The albino keeper at the zoo was Yellen's first cousin, and together they formed the only pair of non-nobles the prince could come close to trusting. "Your Highness," Yellen said. He was small but crafty, with darting eyes and simpler hands. Prince Humperdinck came out from behind his desk. He moved close to Yellen and looked carefully around before saying softly, "I have heard from impeachable sources that many men of Gilder have, of late, begun to infiltrate our thieves' quarter. They are disguised as Florinese, and I am worried." "I have heard nothing of such a thing," Yellen said. "A prince has spies everywhere." "I understand," said Yellen. "And you think, since evidence points that they tried to kidnap your fiancée once, such a thing might have happened again?" "It's a possibility." "I'll close off the thieves' quarters again," Yellen said. "No one will enter and no one will leave." "Not good enough," said the prince. "I want the thieves' quarters emptied and every villain jailed until I am safely on my honeymoon." Yellen did not nod quickly enough, so the prince said, "State your problem." "My men are not always too happy at the thought of entering the thieves' quarters. Many of the thieves resist change." "Root them out. Form a brute squad, but get it done." "It takes at least a week to get a decent brute squad going," Yellen said, "but that is time enough." He bowed and started to leave. And that was when the scream began. Yellen had heard many things in his life, but nothing quite so eerie as this. He was a brave man, but this sound frightened him. It was not human, but he could not guess the throat of the beast it came from. It was actually a wild dog on the first level of the zoo, but no wild dog had ever shrieked like that before. But then, no wild dog had ever been put in the machine. The sound grew in anguish, and it filled the night sky as it spread across the castle grounds, over the walls, even into the great square beyond. It would not stop. It simply hung below the sky, an audible reminder of the existence of agony. In the great square, half a dozen children screamed back at the night, trying to blot out the sound. Some wept, some only ran for home. Then it began to lessen in volume. Now it was hard to hear in the great square. Now it was gone. Now it was hard to hear on the castle walls. Now it was gone from the castle walls. It shrunk across the grounds toward the first level of the Zoo of Death, where the Count Rugen had sat fiddling with some nubs. The wild dog had died. Count Rugen rose, and it was all he could do to bury his own shriek of triumph. He left the zoo and he ran toward Prince Humperdinck's chambers. Yellen was just going when the Count got there. The prince was seated now, behind his desk. When Yellen was gone and they were alone, the Count bowed to his majesty. "The machine," he had said at last, "works." Prince Humperdinck took a while before answering. It was a ticklish situation. Granted, he was the boss, the count, merely an underling. Still, no one in all of Florn had Rugen's skills. An inventor, he had obviously at last rid the machine of all defects. As an architect, he had been crucial in the safety factors involved in the Zoo of Death, and he had undeniably been Rugen, who had been arranged for the only survivable entrance being underground, the fifth level one. He was also supportive to the prince in all of the endeavors of the hunting and battle, and you didn't give a follower like that a quick "get away, boy, you bother me." So the prince indeed took a while. "Look, Ty," he said finally, "I'm just thrilled you smoothed out all the bugs of the machine. I never for a minute doubted you get it right eventually, and I'm really anxious as you can see working. But how can I put this? I can't keep my head above water one minute to the next. It's not just the parties and the gooing and what's her name. I've got to decide how long the 500th anniversary parade is going to be, and where does it start, and when does it end, and which nobleman gets to march in front of which other nobleman. That everyone's still speaking to me at the end of it. Plus, I've got a wife to murder and a country to frame for it. Plus, I've got to get the war going once that's all happened, and all of this stuff I've got to do myself. Here's what it all comes down to. I'm just swamped, Ty. So how about if you go to work on Wesley and tell me how it goes? And when I get there, I'll come watch, and I'm sure I'll be just wonderful. But for now, what I'd like to, what I'd like is a little breathing room, no hard feelings." Count Rugen smiled. None. And there weren't any. He always felt better when he could dole out pain alone. You could only concentrate more deeply when you were alone with agony. "I knew you'd understand, Ty." There was a knock on the door, and Buttercup struck her head in. "Any news?" she said. The prince smiled at her and sadly shook his head. "Honey, I promise to tell you the second I hear a thing. It's only 12 days, though." "Plenty of time, Deluxe darling. Now don't worry yourself." "I'll leave you," Buttercup said. "I was going to," the count said. "May I walk you to your quarters?" Buttercup nodded, and down the corridors they wandered until they reached her suite. "Good night," Buttercup said quickly. Ever since that day he had first come to her father's farm, he had always been afraid whether the count came near. "I'm sure he'll come," the count said. He was privy to all the prince's plans, and Buttercup was aware of this. "I don't know your fellow well, but he impressed me greatly. Any man who can find his way through the fire swamp can find his way to Florin Castle before your wedding day." Buttercup nodded. "He seems so strong, so remarkably powerful," the count went on. His voice was warm and lulling. "I only wondered if he possessed true sensitivity, as some men of great might, as you know, do not. For example, I wonder, is he capable of tears?" "Wesley would never cry," Buttercup answered, opening her chamber door, "except for the death of a loved one." And with that she closed the count away, and alone went to her bed and knelt. "Wesley," she thought then, "do come, please. I have begged you in my thoughts now these many weeks, and still no word. Back when we were on the farm, I thought I loved you, but that was not love. When I saw your face behind the mask on the ravine floor, I thought I loved you, but that was again nothing more than a deep infraction. Beloved, I think I love you now, and I pray you only give me the chance to spend my life in constant proving. I could spend my life in the fire swamp and sing from morn till night if you were by me. I would spend eternity sinking down through the snow sand if you held your hand. My preference would be to last an eternity with you beside me on a cloud, but hell would also be a lark if Wesley was with me." She went on that way, silent hour after silent hour. She had done nothing else for 38 evenings now, and each time her ardor deepened her thoughts became more pure. Wesley, Wesley, flying across the seven seas to claim her. For his part, and quite without knowing, Wesley was spending his evenings in much the same fashion. After the torture was done, when the albino had finished tending to his slashes or burns or breaks, when he was alone in the giant cage, he sent his brain to Buttercup, and there it dwelled. He understood her so well. In his mind he realized that moment he left her on the farm when he swore love. Certainly she meant it, but she was barely 18. What did she know in the depth of her heart? Then again, when he had removed his black mask and she had tumbled to him, surprise had been operating, stunned astonishment as much as emotion. But just as he knew that the sun was obliged to rise each morning in the east, no matter how much a western arrival might have pleased it, so he knew that Buttercup was obliged to spend her love on him. Gold was inviting, and so was royalty, but then but they could not match the fever in his heart, and sooner or later she would have to catch it. She would have less chance than the sun. So when the Count appeared with the machine, Wesley was not particularly perturbed. As a matter of fact, he had an idea what the Count was bringing with him into the giant cage. As a matter of absolute fact, the Count was bringing nothing. It was the albino who was doing the actual work, making trip after trip with thing after thing. That was what it really looked like to Wesley. Things. Little soft rim cups of various sizes and a wheel, most likely, and another object that turned out to be either a lever on a stick or it was hard to tell. "A good evening to you," the Count began. He had never, to Wesley's memory, shown such an excitement. Wesley made a very weak nod in return. Actually, he felt about as well as ever, but it didn't do to let that kind of news get around. "Feeling a bit under the weather?" Count asked. Wesley made another feeble nod. The albino scurried in and out, bringing more and more things. Wire-like extensions, stringy end, and candles. "That will be all," the Count said finally. Nod. "Gone." "This is the machine," the Count said when they were alone. "I've spent 11 years constructing it, and as you can tell, I'm rather excited and proud."